Welcome back to On the Edge. My name is Alex G and I'm here with my guest Field McConnell. We're talking all things 9/11. Don't let that put you off. We're giving you some evidence you definitely won't have heard in the mainstream. Now, I did promise you some viewer questions. We got these through our forums. That's our forums at edgemedia.com/forum. That's where you can find them. And a gentleman called Sherlock, who is one of our regular posters, he actually started off with a question about hard, tangible evidence from 9/11. And you gave us that quartet of stuff that certainly we don't hear in the mainstream. He follows up with this particular line. Why is it that the conspiracy theorists insist that it was all a cover-up, which would have to now implicate by design tens of thousands of people all lying under duress or on pain of reprisals, as to make that notion in itself wholly incredible?
I would correct him simply in the number. There never were more than 100 people that had the big picture of what happened on 9/11. And at least one of the 100 is now deceased. So the prospective defendant pool is 99 people or less. And the operation was extremely complex. I told you I'm connected to it by my North Dakota Air National Guard and by my, that's the air defense angle, and the fact that my college classmate, Chick Burlingame, was flying American 77. I didn't tell you that my own sister appears to have been extorted into some level of complicity in the operation of 9/11. And oftentimes, when 9/11 discussions come up, the two choices, both of them bad, are was it a Muslim attack, a Muslim terrorist attack, or was it an inside job? And it was neither. It was neither a Muslim attack nor an inside job. It was a job that was put on by a consortium of at least 4 nations, and there were complicit insiders in the United States of America, many of them household names, and I'm not being vague or evasive here. We've got them out there on the internet. We do a lot of writing, but it appears my sister is one of the most centrally configured persons, whether she was extorted into that, or she was tricked into that, or she willingly participated. Neither is it my knowledge, nor is it my concern. Her obligation as an American who's sworn an oath to the United States of America, her obligation, like the defendants, is to step forward and let's get the truth of 9/11 and move on.
Now, that obviously will puzzle quite a few people, because they would imagine that maybe at family occasions you would get the opportunity to talk this through with her, perhaps.
She's told me several times that the people that I work with are of questionable mental health, and that when she was very highly placed at the Department of Justice, they got 300 to 400 letters, such as the letters we write every day. I discard that out of hand. I doubt if my sister or the Department of Justice in the United States of America have ever gotten one single communication that is as precise, is well evidenced, and sadly, the truth, as the 18,000 pages of letters that myself and my network, which is abledanger.net, everything we are providing to you, the public here in England, we've already provided it to the Department of Justice, the FBI, the Federal Aviation Administration, and most importantly, the Airline Pilots Association, which is a union in America, which is allegedly charged with maintaining the safety of the airline system. And I have a civil case that was just terminated 2 months ago that indicates to my satisfaction, as well as any informed person who reads the short case, that they're not interested in determining if what I have said in print and in public is accurate or not. And I figure that my thinking is that's criminal.
And this gets back to them putting the blanket dismissal down that you're all kooks and crazy, so why would they pay any attention to it? Is that their get out of jail card, basically?
They're not going to get out of jail. Ultimately, they will be brought to justice, but to go that direction, where they tried to paint any of us safety critics as deranged, unbalanced, let me tell you exactly what they do to airline pilot whistleblowers such as myself. If they can't get you to be quiet by saying, be quiet, they will intimidate you by saying, you're perfectly healthy, but we want you to take a physical. And if you pass that physical, then what that MD, who, by the way, is not qualified to give pilots physicals,
Right.
that MD will send you on, or me in my case, they will send a pilot who will not be quiet. They'll send him to a specific doctor in Los Angeles. The doctor's name is Dr. Elliott. He's used by Continental, Delta, Northwest, United. It's very odd that all these airlines would use the same psychiatrist.
And this is all documented.
Absolutely. There's much in our media in the United States. There's even stories about why are all the airlines using the same doctor, and why is the Airline Pilots Association allowing this to go on? Because in effect, they are taking pilots, and this is not about me, but my history is 29 years as a pilot with Northwest. No problems, no infractions, no medical problems. Suddenly, when I start giving them precise information about the illegal modification of Boeing aircraft, that is so well documented that the United States Department of Justice paid a $615 million fine in June of 2006. Then I come along in December of 2006 and I say that I've discovered this sheet of illegal modifications, and they want me to be quiet. And as you can see, Alex, I'm not the quiet type.
Well, no, absolutely
It's
not.
my
You
obligation
and me
to-
together on this. So what you're actually saying is you have documented evidence that Boeing have been doing things to their planes that they shouldn't have been.
They've admitted it themselves by paying a $615 million fine in June of 2006 to the United States Department of Justice. But there's more.
Right.
The other documentation is that Boeing has published, and the major media has published, that the transgressions for which they were fined include the illegal export of military hardware, and specifically because those critics in your crowd that think people like me make this up, what they need to take a look at is a specific item of hardware called a QRS-11 solid-state gyroscope, and it is made, Raytheon Corporation has these deployed in supersonic Maverick missiles. They have no application that's benign for an airline-type aircraft that does not go supersonic. And I just want to titillate your listeners with this bit. The QRS-11 gyroscope was made by BEI Corporation. The patent on that gyroscope was handled by Rose Law Firm in Little Rock, Arkansas. And this is not the only piece of hardware whose application has been other than by design. And one of the problems is the intellectual property or the intellectual patent attorneys have done some bad things, but that's not for me to solve. It's just, I can tell you that Boeing themselves is aware that when they shipped out 96 flight boxes, which is a flight management guidance system, all of them including a modification from Thales, which is a formerly British, now British-French corporation, THALES. Boeing paid $615 million to shut down this investigation. I think that speaks as to their guilt or innocence very clearly.
And you're not under any doubt that this is the reason that they brought
There's no doubt, but what I'll do is I'll follow up with some well-documented evidence to you in Boeing's own words.
Terrific.
It doesn't get any better than that when Boeing makes the statement that we have huge downside risk because of these items. And that's post 9/11, by the way. It was in 2003.
Right, well, we'll definitely put those links on our website for you so that you're able to actually investigate the evidence yourself, because quite rightly, extraordinary claims need the extraordinary evidence to back it up, and Field, obviously, if you have that, then we'd be delighted to share that with you out there. Dead people stuff. We have some very bizarre names on our forums, and Dead people stuff asks the question, accepting the fact that the planes could have been drones, which was something that you touched on earlier, as a highly qualified flyer, what do you say to those who believe that airlines cannot fly at such closing speeds at that altitude as suggested in all the available video, accepting that such manoeuvres are possible for fly-by-wire?
That's a little, first of all, it's a very good question. But it's a very good question that I would say was written by neither an aeronautical engineer nor a pilot. So I'll try, you may have to help me with some of these things. But as far as The drone question, I previously said that there's no airline pilots in the United States of America that
Right.
would fly beyond 250. Now, if you held a gun to their head, they might do it.
Right, I'm
But
with you.
there never has been an American, and when I say American, I mean a pilot in the United States of America, that would allow anybody to force him to kill his passengers. And if it was quite obvious that he and his passengers were going to die, I can guarantee you, if a human pilot from America was in control of those airplanes immediately before they hit the building, they would have avoided the building,
Right.
and that would have protected the buildings. And,
Yep.
and it's really no incremental risk to the passengers or the crew,
Yep.
because if there were human hijackers in the cockpit, which there were not,
Right.
it's the duty of the captain to go down to the ship, go down with the ship, but not to take any other collateral victims with him. And this would not be the first case of a pilot knowing he was doomed and yet doing something somewhat heroic at the end to spare the suffering of innocent people in the towers.
But we could have the situation where we're dealing with a fanatic who might do that.
Well, the fanatic who might do that would really have to be in the seat controlling the aircraft.
Yeah.
And the fanatics among the suspect pool, if you will, the 23 young Muslim men, none of these young, and I'm not suggesting they couldn't have done it because they're young, because they're men, or because they're Muslim.
Right.
They could not have done what was done in terms of precise flying with the level of experience they had.
Right.
And also, none of them had ever flown a simulator above 250 knots. And these flying objects, and I use that term because apparently the dead people there doesn't like the word drone. These flying objects were going 350 knots. It's not a linear relationship. It's exponential between 250 and 350. If they could handle an airplane at 250, they could not precisely hit a target at 350.
Right.
Not an inexperienced pilot.
So what we're saying is, of the people named as being part of this atrocity, none of those had the skills to be able to do this.
Not even the airline pilots, because
No.
they're not allowed to fly airliners below 10,000 feet going more than 250. Does it happen in an emergency? Yes, occasionally.
Yeah.
And we have emergency, or I shouldn't say we, I'm no longer a pilot. But pilots have not only the emergency authority to do whatever it is they deem necessary to protect the safety of the aircraft and, more importantly, the passengers, but it's mandated of them that they do so.
Right.
Your writer there, or your question, was very good in that it used the term fly-by-wire, and that's significant.
Right.
Because with my own eyes, what I observed in the case of United 175 was in its descending left turn, sweeping turn, high-speed turn into the tower.
Right.
The wings were absolutely steady. They never made small check turns. Human pilots or older autopilots would make a series of small adjustments, and what they're doing is the autopilot or the flight guidance system with fly-by-wire, they have to try to continually update the flight path as it relates to the target.
Right.
And you can look at the tapes yourself 100 times and you'll never see any small incremental turns. The flying object, whatever it was called United 175, it was flown so smoothly into the tower that it could not have been hand-flown by a human.
So you are actually saying that the giveaway is the absolute smoothness of that trajectory.
It's a huge red herring. A human could not do that. Humans are subject to judgmental errors.
Yeah.
And a human might try to aim the airplane one thing, but you can't see the wind. And if the wind was blowing 20 knots that way, a human would have to turn a little bit this way. And there'd be a series of those corrections, and they'd be visible. And you people in the audiovisual industry can certainly slow down a tape and look for it. There is none. It's one constant turn, perfect turn.
And I'd imagine it's the same thing if people think of when they're driving their car or their automobile. You don't just keep your hands there just like that. There's always the slight little movement to the left or to the right.
Yes,
so that's what you're saying here.
Yes, and in flying we call those check turns.
Right.
It's exactly what you do in your automobile, but you just don't use the term check turn, but it's the same thing.
Okay. In terms of what happened on 9/11 and your own journey, at what point did you actually start making a fuss about it? Was it straight away that you sort of said, "Excuse me, I'm not sure about this and that"?
Well, I'll answer you with your own words. Immediately, I started telling my friends and people who valued my judgment, and I'll stop right there and tell you that on 9/11, the very day of 9/11, I was at home on my farm in western Minnesota, and a Pulitzer Prize-winning paper asked if they could come out and interview me. They didn't want to come out and interview me because I was a flake or I was unlikely to understand things. They knew that I was the senior Northwest pilot in the community, and they knew that I'd retired from the Air National Guard, and they considered me an expert witness. And I told them what I've just told you on that day, that it could not be as reported. But to answer your question specifically, on December 4th of 2006, I started getting a whole lot of unsolicited information. And by December 11th of 2006, and I will provide this to you by email immediately after the show, I advised 4 different agencies of the government that these 3 or 4 modifications to airliners existed and they needed to ground the jets. My term was clear the skies. And I picked that term because on 9/11, an FAA attorney who was in control of the airlines, he used the term clear the skies. As a response to 9/11, he has no experience.
We'll find out what happens next after this break. Welcome back to On the Edge. I'm Alex G, and I'm here with my special guest all the way from the USA, Phil McConnell. Now, Phil, we've still got quite a few questions from our audience coming in. One thing I wanted to clarify, we were talking about your sister earlier. Now, this is a lady called Christine Marcy?
Yes, Christine Marcy.
And what it says on Wikipedia about her is she's a retired federal executive with over 30 years of experience in 10 federal departments and agencies. So are you suggesting that that put her in the right place to actually get involved in the conspiracy, as it were?
Not only it put her there by design, by discretion, and I'll give you 2 more names of similar people who have backgrounds that are sort of unknown. None of your viewers have ever heard my sister's name, Christine Marcy, but your viewers in England certainly have heard the name David Cameron.
Yes.
And the viewers all over the world have heard the name Barack Obama.
Just a little bit, yeah.
Well, all 3 of these entities are unknown. You have a David Cameron who has an interesting work history, which is very similar to Barack Obama's work history, which is basically unknown, undisclosed, unproven. It may not be a problem with David Cameron. It's a huge problem to Americans. I believe 91% of us now wonder who this guy is. I happen to go to the same high school as him, Punahou School in Honolulu, Hawaii.
Right.
And I graduated 12 years ahead of him, so I hope that he will give me the latitude as an upperclassman of speaking the truth. But David Cameron and Barack Obama are sort of old ink. So let's go a different direction to somebody that your viewers never would have heard of before this show of yours tonight, Alex.
Yeah.
It's my sister, Christine Marcy. And there's only 2 kids in my family, myself and my sister. We had 2 parents who are now buried in Arlington National Cemetery.
Right.
My father was a career Air Force pilot who was a POW of the Japanese in World War II. My mother was an Army nurse who nursed him back to health. They were married 62 years. They were very patriotic Americans, and I want to stop there for the Europeans in the crowd and say just because an American is patriotic like I am does not mean we support American foreign policy like I do not.
Right.
However, my sister has a master's in foreign service, and I would say that whether it's because she was extorted, threatened, or willingly went down that road, she's in a position, like others, where they've been given a whole salad bar of different jobs, none of which they have no experience in any of them, none of which they are masters of, and it's my belief that the most sinister link here is something no one in this room has probably heard of, the Senior Executive Service in the United States of America. And what that did is, let's say this is a column, the Department of Defense. There's tens of thousands of great patriots in the Department of Defense, many of them well prepared to conduct war properly.
Yeah.
Senior Executive Service, they come and get right on top of the Department of Defense and they dictate downward what to do and they suppress upward criticism. And the Senior Executive Service was created in 1979. So for 32 years, that entire branch of the U.S. government has been laying low. And it's my understanding that it was my own sister that created the senior executive service with the blessing of then President Jimmy Carter. And what their agenda is, I do not know. But keep in mind, she has a Master's of Foreign Service.
So it's another one of these departments, organisations that keeps a very low profile, but puts itself in a very, very important position then.
Very important if you wish to take any entity sideways, whether it's an entity such as the elected government of the United States of America. You can come in overnight and take control of the whole government. And many of the people in America who, like me, question some things like our foreign policy, where did the president come from? I'm not alone. I'm probably in a majority when it comes to questioning our authorities. We as citizens, and you as citizens of England, we need to demand that our authorities are legitimate and that they are doing things that are in the best interest of our countries and our citizens. And we as Americans are getting fairly active. I understand there's getting to be isolated populations within England, especially the ex-military people. Some of the military that's currently given their pink slips while they're on duty in Afghanistan. There's some very bad leadership in the world right now. And I, as an individual, do everything I can to put the spotlight on the bad individuals, knowing that they are a mathematical super minority, but they are given superpower above the majority of people who would like to do the right thing.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. Another question then from Hamish, this one. Is there any truth in the story that Charles Burlingame, who was pilot Flight 77, was involved in a war game exactly 1 year before 9/11?
The man's name is Captain Francis Chick Burlingame. He's my Naval Academy classmate. Something that nobody, including Jesse Ventura, is aware of is that, yes, what you say is true. He was a war gamer at the Pentagon in the Navy Reserves. He did participate in the planning of a attack on America iconic buildings, and it doesn't get more iconic than the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and the U.S. Capitol, which was the fourth target. And the name I'm going to give you that no one in the 9/11 world has ever heard of, and none of our critics have ever heard of, is there is a brigadier general in the North Dakota Air National Guard whose name is Paul Knox, K-N-O-X, the significance of which is Paul Knox was one step above Chick Burlingame in his vertical chain of command at the Pentagon in this branch that did wargaming. And when we're talking about wargamers with great mathematical probability of being unlikely that a wargamer would die in the same war game he's stick flown many times. There were 5 civilians that died from Raytheon Corporation. This is all out there. It's no secret. They died in 3 of the 4 9/11 jets. And my suggestion, and I'm betting my life that I'm right, and I'm right, is that the Raytheon has a pretty high signature in the events of 9/11, however you characterize them. If you characterize them as a Muslim terrorist attack, first of all, I think that's terribly disrespectful to Muslims. But say it as it is, and that's how it's been couched by our media in America. Or if you say it was an inside job, which is also wrong. It was not an inside job, and I say that based on the fact that it's my own Air National Guard unit that tried to respond on 9/11, and what stopped them was the senior executive service. So that's a very good question from Hamish, and it's absolutely accurate. And I want to give you one more specific thing that any of your listeners can Google the next break. The name of the document that they were working on that planned the flying events of 9/11, I'm going to spell it. I'll say it first. Amalgam Virgo 01. I'll spell it alpha numerically correctly. Alpha Mike Alpha Lima Golf Alpha Mike 01. Amalgam Virgo 01. The significance is it's 35-page color document which shows the planning of the attack from drones launched over the Gulf of Mexico, flying north, and an airliner coming across the Seattle area and turning directly towards the Capitol. These are the plans for the attack of 9/11, for the practice. And the practice, here's a little bit of precise information for your critics out there. The 1st and 2nd of June of 2001, the practice for the flying events of 9/11 was conducted at Tyndall Air Force Base, Florida, and the second senior man in NORAD whose name is General Charles Bouchard. This will send chills up your spine because today he's running the air war over Libya, and he was number 2 at NORAD at the site of the practice on the day the exercise went live in New York and Washington, D.C., killing my classmate Chick Burlingame and implicating my sister.
Goodness me. Moving on then to another question. This is back to those from Dead People stuff, so we are taking note of your questions. How would you account for the soft nose cone of such a plane managing to pass through an entire building and emerge the other side with its shape relatively intact?
Which building is he talking about?
I would imagine is he talking about the Twin Towers? It doesn't actually say for sure.
See, that's what I would call a good question, but not a question where the author gave me as much information as I need to answer it.
Yeah.
There's no way in the world the soft, and let me tell you what the softness is, it's fiberglass. The reason the nose of an aircraft is fiberglass is right behind the nose is the radar.
Right.
The radar works by sending out electronic signals which bounce off metal and come back. If you had a metal nose, your radar would sit there and tell you there's metal 3 feet in front of the radar. And so they put fiberglass on, and the fiberglass is somewhat soft. In other words, when airliners fly through hail, dense thunderstorms, which they should not fly through, but when they get into them, sometimes the radome's gone when the airplane comes out the other side. So there's no way in the world that a radome could penetrate any building, whether it's World Trade I, World Trade II, the Pentagon, or the fourth target, which was the Capitol.
Right.
So it's impossible, and I hope that answer suffices.
Yeah, I think it may have been the Pentagon, because his next question was on a similar theme. Even with the official photos from the Pentagon taken from the inner courtyard, how could you account for the deep penetration of the fact that the aircraft nose, and he puts aircraft in inverted commas, nose cone punched through the entire building with such neat symmetrical holes?
Well, I've got his answer. The answer is there's no aircraft that could punch through 5 walls made out of concrete. And so it was not the aircraft that did the punching. And I've mentioned twice already, I'm betting my life on my answers. Here comes a life better. My answer to that question is that the airplane that attacked the Pentagon was not an airliner.
Right.
It was a Douglas A-3 Sky Warrior that had been super modified at this specific airport, Fort Collins, Loveland, Colorado. Strangely, that airport's now closed. There were 2 A-3 Sky Warriors super modified there. And when I say super modified, that's vague. They strengthened the fuselage. They upgraded the engines. They upgraded the navigation. They upgraded everything. And if the men in this room, and there's about 7 of us, if we were all upgrading that aircraft and we were on different shifts, we would not be allowed to talk to each other. In other words, if you're an engine man, you couldn't talk to an avionics guy. I couldn't talk to sheet metal. Sheet metal couldn't talk to the engines. None of the people... Compartmentalization so that nobody smells a rat and stops the operation.
Right.
So anyway, I gave you half an answer. An airplane could not do that. But an A-3 Sky Warrior, and these airplanes on 9/11, there were 20 to 24 of them that were flyable. They were all owned by Raytheon Corporation. I think we've discussed that company before. And they are certainly capable of carrying a AGM-65 Maverick missile, which could be launched just before impact, and it would punch a hole. Or there's other options out there, and to titillate your viewers and also to titillate anybody in the United States of America that wishes I wouldn't speak so precisely, the other option that's out there is a World War II weapon from Germany called a Mistel, and it's not missile, it's Mistel. And I don't know, and if anyone knows for sure what was launched, there's not very many. And if they spoke, they probably would go flatline on their EKG. But it's my obligation to try to get at the truth, and I firmly believe it was an A-3 Sky Warrior, whether it was a bunker buster missile or something based on the German technology, I do not know.
Okay, back to questions from dead people stuff, and I think this answers which particular plane he was on about. On a similar theme, even with the official photos from the Pentagon taken from the inner courtyard, how could you account for the deep penetration, the fact that the aircraft, and the inverted commas, the aircraft, nose cone punched through the entire building with such neat symmetrical holes?
My accounting for that is it's false. It was not the aircraft nose cone. The nose cone could not punch through the outer ring or the four inner rings, so it was something else that punched the hole. Also, had it been the aircraft that made the hole, it would have not have been symmetrical because the aircraft wings, engines, and empennage would either have to slice through the building or they'd have to be visible outside immediately following the incident, which they were not. So the answer to that very good question is that the hole was punched by a piece of forward-firing ordnance, and Raytheon makes something called an AGM-65, which also has a QRS-11 gyroscope for guidance, and it could blow a hole. It's a bunker-busting missile. It could blow a hole in that, and it would be symmetrical. Another possibility, as it pertains to the video he alludes to, I would challenge that man to produce the last 3 frames of that video, because I know them to be in the custody of the FBI, and they will not release them to anyone in America that's interested. And what those frames would probably show, if they were released to us, was what happens immediately after the last thing we've seen, which is a brilliant white flash. And it's my belief that what they would, those 3 frames would be visual evidence of is a forward-firing piece of ordnance coming off a wing rail on a Douglas A-3 Sky Warrior, which would leave this very good question presenter asking me perhaps, well, where's the parts of the airplane? And the answer to that is all of the airplanes used on 9/11, not only the airliners, which I'll recap, American 11, American 77, United 93, and United 175, they were all outfitted with SMAC sonic insulation, which looks, feels, and reacts to vibration, thermal, and sound as insulation, but when it is electronically detonated, it takes the whatever vessel it's in this case an aircraft fuselage, and it raises the temperature from ambient, which would typically be 72 to 74 degrees in an aircraft. It elevates it from 72 to 5,800, which is exactly half the heat of the sun at the surface of the sun. And the scientific significance of this is that would reduce the aircraft, if there were passengers, the crew, the hijackers, the seats, the wings, the tail, the windows, everything would be reduced to plasma. Plasma, and I'm not a scientist, it's my understanding it's the lowest reducible form of matter, and it would just follow right through the hole where the bunker buster missile had opened up a symmetric 16-foot hole.
So that actually fits the bill.
To exceed 250 knots, and that's not to say it couldn't be pushed to 350, because it could, and it was. But the pilots of American and United would not willingly go more than 250 because it's a violation of the federal aviation regulations. Also, later I learned that these alleged hijackers had been trained in simulators and had never gone above 10,000 feet. And that specific piece of information is what caused several FBI investigators and airline instructors to question who these guys really were and what they wanted to do. Because if they really wanted to fly an airliner, you don't spend much time below 10,000 feet.
So, in effect, are you saying that the plane couldn't do that sort of speed at that height? Where are we at with that? No,
the aircraft is capable of doing that, and that's a matter that comes right out of the Boeing regulations and the Boeing flight manual. In terms of the federal aviation regulations, which are common to all the airlines, not only flying within the United States of America, but any foreign airlines, if Virgin or British Air fly into the United States, they have to operate under our rules, which is 250 knots below 10,000 feet. These aircraft were not doing that, and when I say these aircraft, you ask about 2 towers, so let me give you the other aircraft, American 11, and what is very unusual about that incident is that the cameras, there were only one set of cameras, one camera crew, that caught the impact of American 11, and that crew happened to have their camera trained exactly on the impact point, about 11 to 18 seconds before impact, and that's either a very lucky shot or something more than a coincidence.
And that's the French documentary filmmakers, that
The
particular
Naudet,
image. Yeah.
Naudet brothers, yes.
Yeah, yeah. So, again, suspicions on that front. If we move to the Pentagon now, and in terms of what happened there, certainly I know a lot of our viewers will know that there was a lot of feeling that there was a manoeuvre there that was physically impossible for a jet as described. Is that how you see it?
I'll just flesh that out a bit. It's everything you say is correct. I will clean up the language jet is described, and what you're really saying, a transport category airline aircraft, and you're absolutely right. A transport category aircraft could not have flown the maneuver that was tracked on that day, and the maneuver was a right-hand descending turn from 7,000 feet to 10 to 15 feet above the grass, and the speed across the grass was 530 to 540 miles an hour, and that's impossible for an airliner, specifically a 757. Problem number one is it could not negotiate the descending right-hand turn because a 757 and most other airline category aircraft are limited to 2.5 positive or -1 negative Gs, so it either couldn't make the turn or it'd pull its wings off. That led me to believe that if the data was correct about the flight maneuver performed, that this had to be something other than an airline transport type airframe, and I'm confident, in fact I'm betting my life that it was.
And in terms of evidence that has actually come out for this, all of this is sounds to a lot of viewers just as conjecture. So, I mean, is there anything hard fact-wise that they could sort of grab hold of and see for themselves?
Yes, absolutely, and they can find all this on the internet if they choose to look for it. Immediately after the incident at the Pentagon, people working for the United States government, some Air Force, some law enforcement, immediately started picking up little scraps of evidence from the Pentagon lawn and bagging it and removing it. That's not significant to me, although later there's going to be a lot of spoliation of evidence, which is hugely significant to anybody interested in 9/11 truth. But you asked for specific hard evidence of what hit the Pentagon. Let me give you 4 pieces of very hard evidence, all that can be proved with photographs. One is a turbine wheel that was found inside the Pentagon, and that turbine wheel was from a specific engine called in the military J-52, or in the civilian world JT-8D. And they're the same engine, just different applications. Well, that turbine wheel from a JT-8D or a J-52 could not be installed on a Boeing 757. It could be installed on an A3 Sky Warrior made by Douglas, an A4 Skyhawk made by Douglas, a DC-9 made by Douglas, or a 727 or a 737 made by Boeing. But in addition to the fact that that piece of evidence was found, other pieces of evidence that match up well with the Douglas A3 included an air refueling probe. There are no airliners in the world that have air refueling probes. Also, a rectangular section of fuselage, in other words, the sheet metal that makes up the fuselage or the body of the aircraft. 757s are round. Most airline fuselages are round. This was a rectangular fuselage section. The only aircraft that I'm aware of, and I'm aware of lots of airplanes, is the Douglas A3 Sky Warrior, which has a rectangular fuselage. Also, one small window from the cockpit area was found, and that small window was consistent with a Douglas A3. And before we leave the subject of what it was that hit or did not hit the Pentagon, I wish to point out to the families of the survivors that Chick Burlingame, the captain of American Flight 77, Captain Chick Burlingame, was my college classmate at the U.S. Naval Academy, and it's my duty to him as a classmate and the families to seek justice for Captain Chick Burlingame and all the innocent victims of 9/11.
Because it's interesting you say that. A lot of the coverage that we see in the UK about 9/11 and the families is all orientated to the fact that this caused them great distress, that the subject isn't allowed to rest, if you like, and that there isn't that many of the survivors' families who are actually supportive of 9/11 truth. Now, is that the case, or is that to be refuted?
No, I believe that's the apparent case right now, and I'll tell you why. Immediately after 9/11, the victims' families were remunerated for their loss,
Right.
And in exchange for death certificates, they were given a sum of money. And on the other hand, there's people without any money on the table would just like to have closure. But our concern, and when I say our, I'm not an individual. I work for a group called Able Danger, although when I say something that's incorrect, I will take that upon myself individually. But the souls of the people that perished on 9/11, which was not limited to 3,000 Americans. It included people from 28 countries, I believe, many Brits. And for the people, for the survivors that believe in the eternal welfare of the perished, I think that they join us in wanting justice for those who paid.
Okay, so we've done 3 of the planes. Now, how about the 4th plane that went down? Suspicions there, perhaps?
I have better than suspicions, and let me just tell you how I'm connected to 9/11, because there's 3 connections. I mentioned Captain Chick Burlingame is my college classmate from the Naval Academy. We're going to United 93 now, which went down over Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and the North Dakota Air National Guard, from which I retired, was in the air, having launched at 9:32 in the morning of 9/11 from Langley Air Force Base, Virginia. They were initially vectored towards the Pentagon because the incoming track of 93 and also what hit the Pentagon, these incoming tracks were active, and so the F-16s from Langley were scrambled off. They were taken off course. They ultimately came back to going to the Pentagon. They got there too late to observe what hit the Pentagon, but they got there before United 93 was taken down over Pennsylvania. And just in the interest of being very specific, very credible, and very precise, the 3 F-16s were flown by Brad Derrig, Craig Bjorkstrom, and Dean Ekman. And I have spoken with at least one of these fellows at length about what really happened on 9/11, specifically pertaining to United 93. And what the gentleman told me was that he was in position, it's in fighter pilot language, it's called hawking, H-A-W-K, it's like watching, and he was hawking the airliner, United 93. There were 2 F-15s from Otis Air Force Base in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, that were hawking this United 93, and at any moment, it's not a challenging shot for an air defense interceptor to hit a transport category aircraft, and even if it were challenging, there were 3 fighters up there, and they all had multiple weapons. So the thing could have been brought down. The major media story is that it was taken down by the Let's Roll heroes, including Todd Beamer.
And much of that was in the movie about that,
there were
wasn't
2
it?
movies, and one of them at least was made not far from here. By some Brits. And one was funded by General Electric. I've watched both movies, and I find serious academic problems with both of those movies. And if you take a look at who sponsored the movies and what participation they may have had or downside exposure on 9/11, it makes sense that they would put out those types of movies. But I went to my college classmate, as well as the 3,000 innocents, to try to get the justice and the truth that they are deserving of.
Now, we're 10 years almost down the line from this. When you started out on this quest, if you like, to actually expose the truth, did you ever see it panning out as it has done? Because here we are nearly a decade down the line, and it doesn't actually seem that the majority of people are aware that there's anything suspicious in what is called the official story.
Well, I think in the United States, to a large degree, the official story is questioned. I find personally, as someone who's traveled the world, that there's more questions coming out of Europe on the official story. I think Europe, and I include England in Europe as an American. I know that Europeans may see it differently, but I find much more open minds and much more educated people as it pertains to the truth. In fact, a French newspaper in July of 2001 published a story that they republished a story where they said something like this was poised to happen. So we in America are not, we do not have access to easy truth because the media is told what they can put out and what they cannot. And if I was sitting in front of an ABC camera right now, the lights would have been off for the last 5 minutes.
Right. Well, Field, thank you very much for coming to join us. It's flown by this hour, and I hope you, our viewers, have learned something out of that. And we'll be back at the same time next week with more guests to amaze you with the information that they bring to the table. So all that leaves me to do is say, under the radar, around the world, you've been on the edge.